Hello, this is Graham, and this is a short introduction to the idea of being critical in an academic context. It's intended for undergraduate students in the first year of their university or college course, and also for students studying for a Level 4 diploma. Critical thinking is considered to be one of the most significant skills developed in higher education. It's crucial for problem solving and more generally for making sense of situations of increasing complexity. Critical thinking is sometimes focused on critical reading, or formalised as critical analysis, but all three are essentially referring to the same skill. The ability to think critically is so important in the world of work that it effectively distinguishes between those in leadership positions and those who are not. Of course, leadership has to be quite loosely defined, as well as managers, directors and so on. Many people draw on their critical thinking ability, perhaps as advisors, consultants and union officials. As university-level education deliberately cultivates critical thinking, those who graduate may be seen as no longer a part of the community from which they entered college because of this skill. Indeed, some authors have suggested that there is a class distinction between working and middle class that relates to this skill. In other words, emerging from university means that you must have entered the middle class, even if you come from working class roots. Whether you believe that and its many implications or not, what is important is for you to develop these skills. Let's try to correct one of the most common misconceptions about critical thinking. It's not about criticising someone else's ideas or efforts. It is about reflecting on what you observe and applying it to your own work. If it was all about telling someone how really good their work was, even if it really was, then it would be a waste of time for most people involved. This is one reason why critical thinking is often taught alongside the other graduate level skill, reflective practice. You'll often be asked in college to give your peers feedback. When this happens, many people don't want to upset their friends, so they go for a gentle and bland, "I thought that was good." This kind of feedback is no use to anyone. Besides, there's a lot of research that shows that unless someone discovers something for themselves, they'll never change, and certainly not if they're told something has to be different. So what do we mean when we ask people to give feedback? Instead of focusing on the other person, say what you have taken away from observing their work and apply to your own work. Suppose that a student counsellor has a session with a client that's observed by a peer, and in it they use a succession of closed questions that sound more like an interrogation than counselling. The feedback from a peer might be, "I could see how easy it was to get drawn into asking closed questions. I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking of ways of breaking out of that pattern if I find myself caught that way." This almost certainly confirms what the counsellor knew already. They got into a stream of closed questions, and it affirms them by suggesting that this is something that we can all experience, that it's a pattern, and it's something that we can have tactics up our sleeve to address. In the arts, critiquing is very common. In photography, for example, someone might present their portfolio or a draft of their final project. This is often called the crit, and students are often literally sick worrying about it. That's, I'm afraid to say, the result of very bad teaching. Here again, true critiquing is not about their work, but what you take away from it yourself. So a student might present a dozen beautiful images, technically perfect, aesthetically exquisite, yet lacking any coherence, all different styles from different genres and with no obvious story running through them. The feedback might be, "You've really highlighted to me how hard it is to demonstrate both the breadth and depth of our work in one portfolio. On the one hand, we want to show our general skills, but on the other, we want to show that we can go into depth around a subject and have a personal style for that particular piece of work. I can see this is something that I'm going to have to work hard at." The presenting student will know that their portfolio was good, but lacked those things. Simply telling them that rubs salt into the wound. What the peer has effectively done is acknowledge the complexity of the task, highlighted what they must do to get it right, and suggested some criteria to measure it by: depth, style and story. Nobody is hurt, both people learn. Critical thinking is embedded in reading, writing and research. You'll cover all three of these at different stages in your course. To begin with, we're going to look at critical reading. Let's suppose that a book or article has been published about a subject that we have some interest in. We're keen to get as much from it as we can. Articles can be written for a popular audience, such as a lay one in a magazine, or for an academic audience in a peer-reviewed journal. They may be thorough pieces based strongly on evidence, or they could be opinion-based. Opinion pieces are perhaps the best to illustrate the difference. All news media draw heavily on opinion. Watch the evening news and a substantial part of it is the opinion of people about something. Whole chat shows are created around a group of people discussing something, based on their opinions. Many newspapers don't make it very easy to distinguish between the two. The Guardian is one of the few that very clearly labels its opinion column. The people who write here include a few of the regular journalists, but most pieces are contributed by outsiders, readers, people affected by an issue, or politicians and lobbyists trying to share their point of view. This kind of writing is known as opinion editorial, or op-ed for short. It used to be the preserve of the main editor, but in today's complex world, most media channels need many contributors. To begin the critical process, we might first look at the title. Is it factual? Is it controversial? Is it obviously biased? What exactly is the piece about? Some authors are terrible in using cryptic titles that tell us very little, so we may need to read the introduction and a few other parts to discover. We're really asking the question, what is this all about? Then we look at the author, the who question. We may have to skip to the end of the article to discover a little more about them. Are they someone with credible credentials? In other words, do they have recognisable qualifications from a quality institution? Do they represent an organisation known to be expert in its field? Have they published widely before? Is their viewpoint known to be biased? This might not be inappropriate. I'd expect a politician to be biased, for example, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are ill-informed. These all help us decide whether to believe their opinion or not. Assuming that we do feel that they are credible, then we might read the article. There are several things that an opinion piece needs to be assessed against. To begin with, why has this piece been written? This isn't always as clear as you'd expect. Is the author blowing their own trumpet? Are they trying to influence a number of people? Do they want to correct a popular myth? There are loads of reasons why, but when reading something, it can help enormously to understand the author's motives. As we read the piece, we have three particular concerns. Firstly, are the facts underlying it verifiable? In other words, can I check them somewhere else? As long as it's clear, then it doesn't matter so much if there aren't any facts. But what is seriously problematic is when the facts can't be verified, or have little bearing on their use in the article. You might be surprised how often that happens. Secondly, are the conclusions that they put forward realistic? For an opinion piece, they may be unusual, they may be new ideas, but they still need to be realistic. And finally, is the logic of the author reasonable? Do the facts inevitably lead to the conclusions? Have they inferred things that don't quite make sense? Have they extrapolated to an extreme? Let's consider an example. Imagine an article, Radical Solutions Needed for Climate Crisis. While there are still a few distractors, most of us accept that there's a climate crisis these days, and the word crisis suggests that we need some pretty radical answers, and soon. The author, Peter O. Liam, is described as an author and environmental consultant. His affiliation is the National Institute for Crisis Elimination, which goes by its acronym NICE. We've never heard of him nor of the Institute, so we make a mental note to do a Google search on both of them. So far they appear to have tried to satisfy our critical minds, but we're not convinced. We read the article. Peter begins by explaining that he's writing because he feels that the crisis is looming and we need to be looking out of the box for answers. He suggests that the issue behind the crisis is the huge population on the Earth and that it currently has more than 1.7 times the number of people on it than it can sustain. He provides his sources of this information, which we can see are accurate and come from reasonably trustworthy places. He describes the amazing technological innovation going on in the United Arab Emirates, and in particular the creation of the planned smart town known as Masdar City, to which many universities are seconding their cleverest academics. He highlights the experiments that are being conducted by scientists aboard the European Space Station. His facts seem sound. Over the next few paragraphs, he argues that in order to reduce the population burden on Earth, we need to accelerate our exploration of planned settlements on the Moon and Mars, and especially the growth of crops under intensive farming conditions using the closer proximity to the Sun. He infers that these crops could then be shipped back to Earth to feed the population here, and that many people will want to emigrate there for the improved quality of life and abundance of good food and a pleasant climate. Taken individually, some of his arguments seem reasonable, though as a whole they feel a bit far-fetched. His conclusion is that we should focus on these kinds of radical ideas rather than tinkering with oil and gas emissions. But is this realistic? We're left asking how long it will take to develop such commercial-scale production, how soon the continuing emissions will overheat the planet, what proportion of the 3.3 billion extra people that the Earth is carrying could really be persuaded to emigrate to the Moon or Mars to live in an artificial environment. We Google Nice and Peter, only to discover that they are funded almost entirely by 3 petrochemical companies. Of course, this is a silly example, but if you Google settlements on Mars, you'll find 19.5 million results, with some very serious people proposing it. Sadly, many examples of such prose are far more subtle, and that's why we need to be able to read everything critically, and especially those articles that we encounter in our own profession. In the example I just gave, we were looking at a piece of opinion editorial or op-ed. The same principles apply to any academic reading. While textbooks have usually been written by well-known teachers of a subject, and there will have been a review of the likely content and a sample of writing beforehand, they are not extensively checked by anybody else, so unfounded opinions and unjustified conclusions don't necessarily get filtered out. General magazine articles, similarly, will have been considered by an editor as an idea, and the words may have been copy-edited to get rid of grammatical and spelling errors, but they're really little better than op-ed. Indeed, in some ways they're worse, because they can masquerade as factual. Next time you read 12 Steps to Tackle Collective Grief, or something like that, you might just want to review it a little more critically. Academic journals used to be the gold standard for critical use in our studies. There are lots of issues with them nowadays, mainly because of the financial model in which they are published. However, a good journal is still the gold standard for getting work published to most academics. Before a paper is published in a journal, usually 2 and sometimes more independent academics, in other words ones not involved in the paper itself, would have read through a draft and made suggestions for improvements. A good journal uses well-known academic experts for each paper. Smaller circulation, less widely known foreign journals with far fewer resources to call upon may struggle and be less discerning. Having found a journal article that seems relevant to us, we tackle it in much the same manner as the op-ed. What's the title? Who is the author? Which institutions are they affiliated to? When was it published? And why was it written in the first place? Is the information based on primary research, in other words experiments carried out by the actual authors, or secondary, where the authors are reporting work done by other people? We look at their conclusions and ask ourselves if they're realistic. If so, we might look at the introduction to understand the issues that the researchers were working on, and initially at least just glimpse at the method to see how many examples their conclusions are based on. Did they have a large enough sample, or are their conclusions just fanciful? The important thing is not to waste our time reading things that are irrelevant or flawed.
Thank you for watching. Your feedback is always welcome, as are ideas for future courses, classes or videos.